Nietzsche's preface to Beyond Good and Evil is just 2 pages long. It begins with an infamous opening line, "Suppose truth is a woman." Nietzsche compares past philosophers to clumsy and hapless suitors who disappoint and annoy truth with their gruesome seriousness. Here, as elsewhere, he has Kant clearly in mind. Nietzsche calls dogmatic philosophies of the past a kind of noble childishness of the human spirit, something like astrology. Although we are surprised to find that intelligent people were ever serious about dogmatic philosophy or astrology, they may serve an important preparatory function. As astrology gave way to astronomy, perhaps the dogmatism of the past has prepared our minds for something greater. We should be grateful to the dogmatists, even to Plato, writes Nietzsche. In struggling against and overcoming dogmatism, the European mind has acquired a new strength and depth. The fight against Plato and his heirs, including the Christians, has created a new spiritual tension which can be used to strive for something truly great. Ordinary Europeans experience this spiritual tension as a sense of distress or unease. 2 recent movements attempted to discharge this tension, to create something from the built-up potential. But both the Jesuits and the democratic Enlightenment thinkers failed. We free spirits, Nietzsche writes, will use the built-up tension in European culture to shoot for a farther goal, which he does not name. The preface ends here. Nietzsche will take up the critique of past dogmatic philosophies in Part 1 on the prejudices of philosophers. We will examine that next.
Every author pays close attention to how his book starts and ends. So before taking a closer look at Part 1 of Beyond Good and Evil, I want to examine Nietzsche's opening and closing words, sections 1 and 296. These are, as it were, bookends for the work. A quick look at them now will give us some idea of what to expect in between. After summarizing each section, I will comment on some themes to look for as we read the rest of the book. Section 1 focuses on the will to truth, our seemingly innate desire to discover the truth about ourselves and the world around us. Nietzsche asks 2 important framing questions in this section. First, what in us really wants truth? That is, what is the psychological origin of the human desire for truth? Second, the deeper question, what is the value of this will to truth? Why should we want truth at all? Why not rather untruth and uncertainty, even ignorance? No philosopher has yet been bold enough to risk these questions, Nietzsche notes. It seems to him as though he is breaking new ground here. The final section, number 296, wraps up the book with an apostrophe addressed to Nietzsche's thoughts. He addresses his thoughts in this section as though they were personified. His thoughts, which were once so young and new, now are becoming old and dull. Some of you are ready, I fear, to become truths, he says. Nietzsche laments that he and philosophers of his kind, we mandarins with Chinese brushes, can only preserve and immortalize thoughts that are fading or on the verge of being lost. The splendor of his thoughts in full bloom does not come through in works like this. As an author, Nietzsche serves these thoughts in their afternoon or decline. Nobody will guess from his work how marvelous they looked in their morning, their ascendancy. Yet these are the only thoughts he will serve, with all the colors of his creative palette. You, my old beloved, wicked thoughts. So what are we to make of these bookend sections? Nietzsche begins Beyond Good and Evil with questions about our will to truth, questions no philosopher has yet risked asking. And he concludes with a lament that he has only been able to express his wicked thoughts as declining, losing their life and energy, hardening into dull truths. This suggests to me that Nietzsche thinks the true value of his work will not be found in a set of doctrines it produces, but in something more dynamic. As we read, we should watch for signs of the energy, life, and perhaps joy Nietzsche thinks lie behind his Chinese brushes version of the ideas expressed in Beyond Good and Evil. We should look to enter into the mind of the author, to see these ideas as he saw them in the morning of their youth. That wraps up my quick look at the first and last sections of Beyond Good and Evil. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.
In sections 2 through 6 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche introduces 4 important themes that run through the rest of the work. In section 2, the theme is his opposition to the metaphysical, Platonic, and Christian otherworldliness. The mark of a metaphysical thinker is his faith in opposed value pairs. It is this faith, or prejudice, that Nietzsche intends to overcome in his philosophy. The will to truth that characterizes these philosophers may itself be a manifestation of deeper, instinctive human drives working through them, Nietzsche suggests. And the philosophical truths they have attained may be provisional perspectives only, to be replaced by a fuller, deeper worldview later on. In this spirit, Nietzsche calls for philosophers of the dangerous maybe, who will ask and answer the question of the deeper roots of the will to truth. Such philosophers are coming, he says. We may see this as an echo of Socrates' prophecy of future philosophers at the end of Plato's Apology. The theme of section 3 is the deeper psychological drives that shape philosophers' works. Philosophy, and even logic, Nietzsche says, are the result of these unconscious drives. The conscious thoughts and writings of philosophers are channeled and guided by their root instincts. Philosophical reasoning is not the ground floor of the human self, so to speak. It is more like the third or fourth floor, and the hidden drives and instincts lie below them. Each philosopher's teachings reflect his inner psychology, rather than his rational grasp of external realities. The factor that drives all philosophies is the demand for the preservation of a certain type of life. This, we will see shortly, is the will to power. In section 4, Nietzsche moves beyond the will to truth, beyond true and false, we might say. He notes that while life, which is will to power, might be served by finding and believing the truth, it may also be that life demands falsehood in order to prosper and grow. But even to ask whether this is the case is to stand beyond good and evil, beyond true and false already. Nietzsche aims to resist philosophers' accustomed tables of value, looking instead for something deeper than the will to truth. He is acting here as a psychologist as much as a philosopher. Section 5 serves as a lead-in to the last major theme in section 6. Here, Nietzsche accuses past philosophers of being naive, but also of failing to be sufficiently honest with themselves and with their readers. Nietzsche's dose of honesty comes in section 6, where he introduces the theme that philosophy and morality are ultimately expressions of their author's personality and deep psychology. So, philosophical doctrines and systems come not from the truth of things and a will to grasp that truth, but rather from the personal character of the one philosophizing. A man's moral doctrines reflect who he is, rather than his character being shaped by his moral code. Philosophy, then, is ultimately a form of personal testimony, and perhaps should be evaluated on personal rather than impersonal terms. This suggests a new way of doing philosophy. We might use it to critique, say, Kant's philosophy, and we might bend it around to understand Nietzsche's project in this book. How does what he writes here reflect his own inner arrangement of instincts? Are we to evaluate this book not on whether its contents are true or false, but on whether the personality they express is one we approve of? We will address these and other questions as we work our way through the rest of the book. That's a look at sections 2 through 6 from part 1 of Beyond Good and Evil. After the first 6 sections of Part 1 of Beyond Good and Evil, there are about 18 pages left in this part on the prejudices of philosophers. In this video, I will comment on selections from these remaining sections. In section 9, Nietzsche attacks the Stoics and specifically their doctrine of natural law. Live according to nature is the Stoic motto, but Nietzsche observes nature is not orderly but wasteful and cruel. Despite their claim to wish to conform to nature, he says the Stoics really want something else. What they want is to impose their ideal or their morality on nature. They cannot recognize anymore that this is what they do, however. They're in a deluded state, and this is the case with other philosophies. They try to create or recreate the world in their own image. And so Nietzsche writes, philosophy is the tyrannical drive itself, the most spiritual will to power. So here Nietzsche is reducing philosophy itself to an acting out of the will to power over and over again in the history of thought. In section 13, Nietzsche critiques the idea that self-preservation is the fundamental life principle that explains organic activity. He notes that living beings do not, in fact, seek to preserve their lives. This is not the most fundamental biological drive. Life, Nietzsche says, seeks to dominate, to overwhelm, to discharge its strength into the environment around it, onto beings around it. Life itself is will to power. This is a fundamental doctrine of Nietzsche's. Self-preservation, he says, then is only a side effect of this much more fundamental will-to-power drive. I think Nietzsche gives us here his critique of Darwinian ways of thinking. Self-preservation and reproduction of the species are secondary to this more fundamental physiological, psychological drive, which is the will to power. In section 14, Nietzsche attacks physics and prejudices associated with it. Physics, he says, is an interpretation of the world, not an explanation of the world. Sense evidence counts strongly in favor of physics, but this is an appeal to the fundamentally plebeian tastes of the present age. Nietzsche contrasts these with the Platonic system, which he calls a noble way of thinking, which involved resisting the obvious evidence of the senses. Platonic philosophers, Nietzsche notes, found a kind of higher mastery in overcoming the obvious evidence of the senses. And of course there is some irony here in Nietzsche praising Plato in order to deride modern physics, modern believers in modern physics. But he concludes this section by noting that perhaps this kind of crude physics, belief in physics, is the right sort of philosophy for a tough, industrious race of machinists with rough work to do, here obviously referring to the Americans. Keep in mind Nietzsche is writing this in the 1880s. In section 17, Nietzsche attacks the superstitions of logicians. He notes that thought comes to us when it wishes, not when I wish. So in the statement, I think, we would be wrong to regard the ego as a condition for the activity or event of thinking. Nietzsche says thinking happens, but it is a pure supposition or prejudice to add I as the agent of this action. He calls it a grammatical habit of supplying an agent for every event or activity. So he is criticizing here easy assumptions about the ego and the self, and he's also criticizing the immediate certainty of the Cartesians and the rationalists. He's criticizing the idea that we can have mental events about which we cannot possibly be wrong because of their clarity and distinctness and metaphysical certainty. In section 20, Nietzsche describes philosophy as an atavism, that is, a leftover relic of a previous stage. Philosophical concepts, he notes, form parts of an interconnected system, and they obey an unseen imperative. Something within leads them, something impels them in a definite order, he writes. Philosophy, he says, is a kind of return to the deep recesses of the soul, an atavism of the highest order. perhaps we should say an atavism in the realm of the spirit, in the realm of the intellect. And so he uses this to explain the resemblance of the Indian, Greek, and German philosophies and philosophizing based upon their linguistic affinity. He gives a physiological and racial origin of ideas, and he explicitly contrasts this with the Lockean blank slate idea. In section 21, Nietzsche argues against a causa sui, a self-caused event. He's arguing here against free will, the idea that the will can be free without any prior determinant. Free will, he says, is a superstition and a contradiction. And Walter Kaufmann notes in a footnote that Nietzsche here is attacking a position which is very similar to the position that Jean-Paul Sartre will articulate more than 50 years later. The desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions, oneself, and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance, and society involves nothing less than to be precisely this causa sui, and, with more than Munchausen's audacity, to pull oneself up into existence by the hair, out of the swamps of nothingness. So what we have here, I think, is Nietzsche disagreeing with the position that Sartre will eventually articulate about the radical freedom and responsibility of the self. He's going to want to pin the self down to its physiological and spiritual origins and components. Cause and effect, he writes in this section, are useful fictions only. In real life, he says, it is only a matter of strong and weak wills. In section 22, Nietzsche criticizes the idea of laws of nature. He says physicists enjoy speaking of nature conforming to law, but this, he thinks, is a projection of and support for modern democratic egalitarianism. The scientist as much as says, all parts of nature, all particles of matter of whatever character, obey the same inexorable, impersonal laws. This, says Nietzsche, is an interpretation, not a text. Another interpretation, Nietzsche's interpretation, is that nature instead is the relentless struggle of strength against strength. Nature is the combat arena of will to power. And Nietzsche is comfortable with his interpretation being recognized only as an interpretation. He says at the end of the section, so much the better. His point here, I think, being that there is no single interpretation that is the correct, true interpretation. The laws of nature that the physicists describe are just as much an interpretation as his will to power interpretation. In section 23, the final section of this part, Nietzsche describes psychology as the new master science of the human race. No philosopher, he says, has yet understood psychology, physiology, and the will to power as Nietzsche does. This involves recognizing that hatred, envy, covetousness, and the lust to rule, to dominate, are essential conditions of life. And recognizing this fact can produce a kind of seasickness of the spirit, a kind of vertigo which is almost overwhelming. But Nietzsche says, all right, let us clench our teeth, let us open our eyes and keep our hand on the helm. We sail right over morality by daring to make our voyage there. So, he is concluding this section by blasting through the prejudices of the philosophers into this new world that he is imagining and articulating, this new reign of psychology, which opens up, he thinks, the most profound world of insight yet made available to man. And he announces at the end of this part that psychology will now be the queen of the sciences. This brings us to the end of section 23 and the end of part 1 of Beyond Good and Evil. We'll turn to part 2 next. Part 2 of Beyond Good and Evil is titled The Free Spirit. It is 21 sections long and occupies about 21 pages in the Walter Kaufmann translation. This part transitions from Part 1 on the prejudices of past philosophers and takes up the nature of present philosophers whom Nietzsche addresses as we free spirits, and discusses the character of the philosophers of the future, the ones who are prophesied as coming at the end of Part 1. This video will discuss the first half of Part 2, sections 24 to 31. Major themes of these sections include the solitude and the elitism of the new philosophers. In section 24, Nietzsche discusses the holy simplicity of prior philosophers, their thought dominated by superficiality and wrong inferences. Present philosophy retains its faith in opposite values, says Nietzsche, but we see through it. In section 25, Nietzsche offers a warning to his allies, fellow free spirits. Do not be tempted by martyrdom, he says. Do not be lured into thinking that you will suffer for truth's sake. In fact, he says, be indifferent to the judgments of others entirely. Instead, choose solitude and wear a series of subtle masks to conceal your true teachings. In this way, you will avoid the fate of men like Bruno and Spinoza, whom Nietzsche thinks ended in vengeance, bitterness, and moral indignation, qualities that are incompatible with greatness of spirit. In section 26, Nietzsche characterizes the emotional life of the elitist philosopher. It is one of disgust and disguise, and ultimately withdrawal into the solitude of oneself. He also notes here that cynicism is a base imitation of philosophy. He calls it the closest that base men ever come to honesty. In sections 27 and 28, Nietzsche takes up the questions of pacing and tempo. We proceed, he says, at Ganges' pace, that is, at an exceptionally slow civilizational tempo, and we are misunderstood by our contemporaries who proceed at a tortoise pace or a frog pace. Even our good friends, Nietzsche says, should be given significant leeway, as they will misunderstand us for just this reason. In section 28, Nietzsche continues this thought with a discussion of language and translation. Languages, he says, have different tempos. So, for example, German, being quite a slow language, is almost incapable of expressing ideas and thoughts in the presto mode, that is, rapidly. Nietzsche begins section 29 by saying, independence is for the very few. It is a privilege of the strong. The solitude that is required for these philosophers requires tremendous inner discipline, and it is spiritually quite dangerous. If one enters the labyrinth unprepared, Nietzsche says, one is likely to be torn to shreds by the minotaur of one's conscience. In section 30, Nietzsche discusses the esoteric-exoteric distinction. Our highest insights, he says, will sound like folly to ears they are not meant for. That is, we will inevitably be misunderstood by the many. But he redefines the exoteric and the esoteric. They are not a matter of clarity or hiddenness or obscurity, but rather a matter of low and high. The exoteric looks up at the truth from below, and the esoteric looks down at it from above. In this section, there's also a hint of the transvaluation of values. Nietzsche says, what is nourishing for higher men will be poison to his inferiors. The higher, better kind of man can endure things, morally and spiritually, that would destroy lower men. And in section 31, Nietzsche discusses the errors of youth, a kind of impetuous wrath and reverence, loving and despising without sufficient nuance. And he notes that even the turn against one's youthful errors can itself be a product of youthful thinking, as it involves taking sides. It involves, again, this faith in opposite values, which he has been criticizing. That brings us to the end of roughly the first half of Part 2 of Beyond Good and Evil. We will turn next to section 32 and then the second half of Part 2. In section 32 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche discusses the three stages of social morality. The first stage is the pre-moral stage. This is the stage that characterizes prehistorical man, cavemen and hunter-gatherers and the like. In this system of moral thinking, the value of an action is determined by its consequences, so the action itself and the intention behind the action is irrelevant to its moral worth. This is a pre-philosophical way of thinking about the value of actions, and involves no attempt at self-knowledge. It is psychologically very primitive. Nietzsche writes, "The retroactive force of success or failure is what led men to think well or ill of an action." So we might think, for example, that a particular tactic in hunting might be regarded as good by primitive man because it leads to a greater amount of food available for the clan or for the tribe. The success in bringing food is what causes them then retroactively to value the skill at hunting, which led to that increased food supply. The second stage of human morality is the moral stage. This is the stage that has arisen as man has become civilized over the last 10,000 years or so. It has been a gradual process taking place step by step in some regions of the earth, most especially Europe. In this system of moral thinking, the value of an action is determined by its origin, not by its consequences. Nietzsche observes that this is a kind of psychological progress for the human race. It involves greater refinement, greater subtlety of vision, and it constitutes the first reversal of values and the first attempt at self-knowledge and psychological insight by human beings. But in the modern period, certainly, this has led to superstition, the origin of an action being reduced to its intention alone. Here, I think Nietzsche is obviously thinking of Kant and Kantian ethics. This prejudice of intention-based ethics is what dominates moral discourse to the present day. The third stage of social morality is the extramoral or the post-moral stage. Nietzsche says we are now at the threshold of a new reversal in values, a new progress to a higher stage of refinement and subtlety in the human spirit. In this new era, the value of an action will be determined by what is unintentional in it, that is, by the drives, the psychological drives deep beneath it, or by the will to power. The conscious intention will be irrelevant in this mode of valuing because it represents the surface or skin of the action only and is not a source of its worth. Intention, says Nietzsche, is merely a sign requiring interpretation. The sign has no meaning in itself. And the morality of intention, thinking here again of Kant, is a philosophical prejudice. It is something like alchemy or astrology, and most crucially for Nietzsche, it is something to be overcome. And this is what constitutes the long, secret work of the group that Nietzsche refers to as we immoralists. In the second half of Part 2 of Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche takes up two major themes: perspectivism and the use of masks, and the character of the philosopher of the future and its relation to the free spirit philosophers of today, including Nietzsche. In section 34, Nietzsche introduces us to his doctrine of perspectivism. Although he does not use that word or define it explicitly, perspectivism is something like Nietzsche's epistemological doctrine, that all claims are perspectival. There is no objective knowledge, there is no objective world against which we could measure different truth claims. There is no thing in itself, there is no world of Platonic forms, there is no objective material world which will somehow give us the truth and let us sort out the true from the false among our claims. And he spends most of this section, I think, attacking the metaphysicians, again, without naming them. He attacks the view that the apparent world is some kind of error that we need to get behind. And he makes a half-ironic observation at the beginning of this section that people who blame our minds for our errors may be giving themselves a basis for doubting the very process and authority of thinking itself. He becomes more serious then and attacks the naivete of the metaphysicians who are in a position of asking reality to please show itself behind appearances. Metaphysical philosophers, Nietzsche thinks, are in the position of begging the appearances to go away to find what is truly real behind them. Nietzsche is going to take a very different approach to the question of reality and truth and deception. Nietzsche notes that the metaphysicians have an almost touching faith in immediate certainties. These are things like the cogito or sense impressions, those things about which we cannot possibly be mistaken. For many modern philosophers, these are the sorts of epistemic authorities that are going to finally allow us to get behind the deceptive array of appearances to what's truly real out there. Nietzsche contrasts this naive faith with the free spirit philosophers who have a duty to universal suspicion. They have a duty of interrogating and viewing virtually every truth claim with a certain kind of suspicion. Nietzsche announces here also that he thinks very differently about deceiving and being deceived. The view that he rejects, I think, is the view of the metaphysicians who want not to be deceived. What they want is to have the truth. They want to move from a state of being uncertain or mistaken about the world to a state of being correct about the world. And Nietzsche asks, why? Why would one want the truth and not rather something other than the truth? The view that truth is more important and better than appearance, he says, is merely a moral prejudice. He calls it the worst proved assumption in the world. Nietzsche tells us in this section that life itself depends upon appearance and perspective. The whole idea of getting away from or beyond or behind appearance, he thinks, is a mistake. Nietzsche here, I think, is arguing against the polarity of true and false, this faith in these opposed values. Instead, he proposes different degrees of apparentness, like shades of light and dark in painting, about which painters also use the term value. Nietzsche asks, what if it turns out that our world is in fact a fiction, and even the supposed need for an author of that fiction is itself part of the fiction? He suggests here at the end of this section that we adopt an attitude of irony about the subject as well as the object and the predicate of our propositions, that we be ironic about the cogito, about the I of philosophical inquiry, about we ourselves the ones doing the inquiry. And this raises for me an important question that we'll carry forward. What would it be like for us as philosophers to live beyond true and false, to adapt the title of this work a little bit? In section 36, Nietzsche gives us a thought experiment. What if it were the case that our desires, passions, and drives were the only reality to which we had access? There were no higher or other reality, either spiritual or material, that we could know. Even thinking, he says, would be a relation of these drives to each other. Even our thinking about this problem then, something connected to these drives. Would it then be possible to reduce all reality to different manifestations of these drives? And would such a reduction be itself a satisfactory explanation of the material world and the world that we live in? Not, he notes, as a deception or an illusion, as some philosophers have claimed, but as the basic reality. This is what the ground level reality of the world is like. It's a relation of these drives. This would amount to reducing all causality to a single cause, and I think we can contrast Nietzsche here helpfully with later neo-Darwinian thinkers who may do something similar with natural selection and the passing on of genes. Nietzsche goes on to claim that all life is will to power. All of these drives and instincts flow from the will to power, and this is the sense in which Nietzsche will say all reality and all life is will to power. The intelligible character of the world itself is nothing other than will to power. Our thought and our truth claims, what we are doing right now, it's all will to power. Nietzsche in section 39 also notes the divergence of truth from happiness, except for certain naive metaphysicians who go on about the good, the true, and the beautiful. Truth, Nietzsche notes, does not lead to happiness. Truth, in fact, can be dangerous, and too much truth, he says, can kill us. And if that's the case, then we might be able to measure each individual's strength of spirit by how much truth he's able to endure. Lower level spirits, weaker people would be able to endure less. The more of the truth of things you can face, the stronger spiritually you are. This is an important point to keep in mind for later in the work. In section 40, Nietzsche turns famously to the question of masks. He notes that profound spirits wear masks and even have masks growing around them constantly because of the false and shallow interpretations of their work by others, especially by their inferiors, by people who are destined, as it were, to misunderstand them. Kaufmann, the translator,
thinks this is quite a significant section because here Nietzsche hints that there are many layers to his work and many different reactions which he anticipates, not all of which are equally revealing of Nietzsche's true thought and true intentions. So I ask, how, if this is the case, can we unravel Nietzsche's writings to find his true opinions and his core doctrines? He's not going to tell them to us straight, but only ironically he'll tell the truth but tell it slant. Here we might think of Nietzsche as being as similar as an ironist to Socrates, to Plato's Socrates. We'll take up that contrast more later on as well. The last 3 sections of Part 2 turn to the character of the new philosophers, the philosophers of the future. In section 42, Nietzsche makes an elaborate triple pun in German, which I'll explain briefly before moving on. Nietzsche refers to these new philosophers. He says, I will give them a new name. I will call them Versucher, which I will translate here as being tempter experimenters. It really means both. The term really means both of those. The German word Versuch means experiment. It can also mean attempt, as Kaufmann explains in a footnote. Versuchung means temptation, and Versucher, a person who does these things, is either an experimenter or a tempter. And Nietzsche, as it were, means both of these meanings simultaneously. The philosophers of the future will attempt new things. They will make experiments that are also temptations. And these will be temptations both for themselves and for us and for other people. In section 43, Nietzsche discusses the relation of these new philosophers to truth. He notes that they will have truth, as all philosophers have had their truths, but they will be non-dogmatic about it. Truth will be something of a personal possession, almost like a coat of arms for a royal house. Truth will be reserved for the elite who can endure it. They may say, my judgment is my judgment, and that's because no one else is worthy of it. One has to prove oneself my equal before they can share in my judgment. The idea of my making truth claims that would somehow be binding for everyone is no longer an assumption that Nietzsche will employ. So we have here great things for the great. And Nietzsche says what is common always has little value. He's pointing here towards another core teaching of his, the necessity of an order of rank in the realm of the spirit. And he makes here his famous observation that there is a certain bad taste of wanting to agree with many people. And I'll note in passing that this is primarily an aesthetic judgment about wanting to agree with many. It's in poor taste. It's something one just ought not to do because it's a low, base, shameful thing to do. In section 44, the final section of this part, Nietzsche discusses the relationship between 3 different types of philosophers. The philosophers of the future, these new men that are coming, who are thoroughly different from anything that is on the earth now. Nietzsche refers to them as very free spirits at one point. Contrasted with these are the free spirits of the present age, including Nietzsche himself. These people are the heralds and precursors of the philosophers of the future. So Nietzsche is casting himself here not so much as a messiah as a precursor. He doesn't have a messiah complex so much as he has a John the Baptist complex. And the third group are the pseudo-free spirits of today, Nietzsche's contemporaries who he thinks claim falsely to be free spirits, and he criticizes them witheringly in this section. He contrasts we free spirits with the so-called free spirits of today. These are the free thinkers, the levelers. Nietzsche calls them slaves of democratic taste. They cannot practice solitude. Their thought is ridiculously superficial. And what they want is the opposite of what the free spirits want. They want herd happiness. They want utilitarian benefit for all. They want equality, sympathy. They want to abolish suffering. They blame the societies of the past for being engines of suffering. And Nietzsche says this is close to the opposite of the truth. Nietzsche refers to himself and his fellow free spirits as opposite men, and notes that the advancement of the type man can come through struggle and suffering, as well as through happiness. And this explains the silence of the free spirits. They are opposed to this modern antipathy to suffering, and they realize their opposition may be dangerous. Nietzsche ends this section and this part with a long encomium to the free spirit, also hinting that the future philosophers will be similar to this. These free spirits are independent, They are grateful for some of their suffering. They are curious, cruel, impenetrable, and solitary. Part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil covers sections 45 through 62 and is about 17 pages long in the Kaufman translation. Kaufman's title of this part, What is Religious?, suggests a parallel with the title of Part 9, What is Noble, but the parallel is not there in German. The German title of Part 3 is Das religiöse Wesen, meaning the religious character or manner. Here, Nietzsche will give his thoughts on the psychology of religious belief, its origins and cultural effects. This video will cover 3 main themes in Part 3: the character of the saint, the tension between religious life and modern society, in which Nietzsche surprisingly seems to favor religion, and the effects of Christianity, both positive and negative. In section 47, Nietzsche confronts the psychological case of the saint, the holy man, who suffers and denies himself for the sake of God. How is such a human character possible? One reason we find the saint ascetic so interesting, says Nietzsche, is his union of opposites. We often see a bad man transformed into a good and holy man. Think here of St. Augustine, for example. Thus, the saint seems to be a type of overcoming the opposed values that are a major theme of this work. Powerful men have often bowed before the saint's riddle of self-conquest, writes Nietzsche. This is because they recognize in the saint a strong will, eager for the challenge of self-overcoming. In praising and honoring the saints, powerful spirits praise and honor these same qualities in themselves. This is the will to power. Similarly, the fear that powerful men feel when looking on the saint, the fear that the saint has discerned some hidden truth about reality, some hidden danger of which the powerful are ignorant, this also reflects their awareness of will to power. So according to Nietzsche, both the saint's strength of will and the admiration he inspires are due to his instantiating the will to power even in his self-discipline and asceticism. In section 54, Nietzsche notes that modern philosophy, especially following Descartes, aims to abolish the old concept of the soul, and as such is by its very nature anti-Christian. But if modernity is opposed to Christianity, this does not make Nietzsche automatically pro-modern. In section 58, he roasts a certain type of condescending German biblical scholarship. A religious life of prayer and devotion to God requires leisure and an aristocratic attitude toward work, writes Nietzsche. And modern industrialized democratic Europe, our modern, noisy, time-consuming industriousness, proud of itself, stupidly proud, is incompatible with religious life. Rather, modern society trains and educates people for unbelief. But Nietzsche does not approve of this new modern atheism. Among such ignorant and proud moderns, he identifies one type for special scorn: people who have lost all religious instincts and no longer know what purpose religion ever served. They just marvel at its persistence as they go about their business and their pleasure. Nietzsche places the great majority of German middle-class Protestants in this class of people, and his description of this group contains some elements of the last man he describes in Zarathustra's prologue. Perhaps these moderns who have forgotten the spiritual ambitions of religion are a sort of proto-last man. Perhaps we should call them penultimate men. In the second half of section 58, Nietzsche rips into the German critical scholars of religion, who take a smug, superior attitude toward the beliefs and believers they study and explain. I think Nietzsche here is condemning the shallow, bourgeois critics of Christianity, who underestimate both its ambition and its value. They live in a religionless world, a spiritually flat world. And this world without greatness is not a future Nietzsche wants for human culture, as we will see later in the book. In the final 2 sections of Part 3, Nietzsche catalogues the positive and negative effects of religion on European culture and psychology. religion has been helpful in governing peoples and bringing them to more advanced levels of cultural and spiritual development. It has promoted self-possession, silence, and self-overcoming, all things Nietzsche praises in his own positive vision for man. However, the negative effects of religion are substantial, he claims. In relieving suffering and preserving the weak, it has worsened the human race, short-circuiting what we might call the natural selection cycle. It has also inverted the values of strong and weak into good and evil, which he will say more about in Part 9. Nietzsche calls Christianity the most calamitous kind of arrogance yet, for it is not hard enough to give the world new, exceptional individuals, overmen. Instead, it has, so to speak, kept the European spirit on a low simmer, allowing the pernicious egalitarian spirit of modernity to infect mankind. The result is the sickly, mediocre herd animal type of man, and the decline of strong and masterful human types. Nietzsche sees this effect on the psychology of modern man as Christianity's greatest crime. This concludes my commentary on Part 3 of Beyond Good and Evil. We will turn to Part 4 next.
Part 4 of Beyond Good and Evil is titled Epigrams and Interludes. This is a transitional part between the first 3 and the last 5 parts of the book. It is about 15 pages long in the Kaufman translation and consists of 125 numbered sections. Most of these sections are a single sentence. They are basically tweet length, and you will find some of Nietzsche's most memorable and famous quotes in this section. I think Nietzsche means these epigrams as a kind of palate cleanser for the reader, so I recommend that you browse through them. Don't try to read too deeply for meaning, but appreciate Nietzsche's style and wit as he touches lightly on themes that he has already raised and that he will continue to develop in the latter half of the book. Here is a selection of my favorite sections from this part, jumping around and arranging them thematically. Enjoy. On the topic of crime, section 109. A criminal is frequently not equal to his deed. He makes it smaller and slanders it. Also, section 110. The lawyers defending a criminal are rarely artists enough to turn the beautiful terribleness of his deed to his advantage. And section 116. The great epochs of our life come when we gain the courage to rechristen our evil as what is best in us. On the character of the great man, Nietzsche tells us in section 74, a man with spirit is unbearable if he does not also have at least 2 other things, gratitude and cleanliness. Also on the topic of the great man, section 126, a people, ein Volk, is a detour of nature to get to 6 or 7 great men. Yes, and then to get around them. Also, section 167. In men who are hard, intimacy involves shame and is precious. Walter Kaufmann notes that many of these epigrams foreshadow Freud in significant ways. Among these is number 68. I have done that, says my memory. I cannot have done that, says my pride, and remains inexorable. Eventually, memory yields. Number 75. The degree and kind of a man's sexuality reach up into the ultimate pinnacle of his spirit. Section 158. To our strongest drive, the tyrant in us, not only our reason bows, but also our conscience. And finally, section 146. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And when you look long into an abyss, the abyss also looks into you. I hope you've enjoyed this quick tour of Part 4 of Beyond Good and Evil. We'll look at Part 5 next.